morning's program to be our lead speaker, and we are delighted to have him here today. He also flew out from California to join us, and by way of Vienna, Austria, I found out last night. And we are looking forward to his talk today on innovation in the marketplace. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Tom. And while it's accidental that I flew by way of Vienna, our host reminded us at the beginning of this conference that the champion, at least in the economics field about innovation, was Joseph Schumpeter. Now, Schumpeter had three great aspirations. One was to be the world's greatest economist. A second one was to be the best horseman in Austria. And the third one, so I understand, was to be the best lover in Vienna. Only the first has been on my research agenda in terms of assessing his contributions. And in many ways, Schumpeter set us down the right path, and he gave us some general guidance. But it's people like you've heard this morning on the panels that are the ones that are actually trying to flesh out the story of how innovation takes place and public policy towards innovation in the modern economy. And this, sadly, has been a delayed process because the field that I come from, which is economics, still insists on being substantially static. And it's only here at law schools and in business schools that I would argue you actually get a reasonable, intellectually vibrant discussion around issues relating to innovation, because the economics departments have largely taken themselves out of the game, although of course they would assert otherwise. Needless to say, public policy, be it antitrust policy, innovation policy, we don't really have one. Industrial policy, we don't really have one of those either. But public policy in general is, I believe, handicapped by the fact that scholars in general don't understand much about innovation. And if they have put their attention to innovation, it is rather cursory. So what I thought I would do today is try to pull together just some of the threads of this conference this morning. Because I think, and kudos to the conference organizers, but I think many of the key issues that are important in the new economy, if I can use that term, or the digital economy, were touched upon and went into in some depth. And I want to just sort of briefly go over some of those points and then try and pull it together to show those of you that are not so steeped in economics that in fact this is a big break from what the mainstream textbooks have to say. And so when you go away from here, you won't find everybody understanding or agreeing, or they will merely go forth with policy pronouncements that are in fact very much at odds with what folks such as yourself think are important. So the first major point, which I think animates this whole conference, and unless there's some closet static neoclassical economists in the room, I think we all agree that innovation is what drives the economy forward, and that the competition that matters, and this is the bit that we get from Schumpeter, the kind of competition that matters is dynamic competition. Now, what is dynamic competition? Well, as Schumpeter said, it's not just about the new product, it's about the new systems of organization. In fact, Tom Hazlitt and I were talking about this last night. I mean, it was a little bit enigmatic in Schumpeter. What was he really meaning when he talked about new systems of organization? But in part, he was talking about new business models. But he was talking about new organizational structures. He was talking about all the things that we were talking about here this morning. So we I think, have to recognize that Schumpeter hit the nail on the head. And he also pointed out that dynamic competition was to static competition what bombardment was to forcing a door. Or put differently, static competition really is fundamentally not very important. Say that to the classic antitrust guys, and they'll have a heart attack because 90% of the apparatus they have, of course, is built around thinking about static issues and static efficiencies, and dynamic competition really has to take the back seat, is implored every now and again when they get into a difficult position, but is quickly forgotten. So the first point I think that we want to make here is that dynamic competition is the kind of competition we should be focused on, and static competition really doesn't matter very much, and one could actually argue that the best kind of competition policy is really innovation policy. Anything that favors innovation, that favors the future, will probably in the end drive competition, because innovation is in fact the biggest driver of competition, innovation particularly from the outside but also from the inside. Second point that I want to make, and I think all of you understand it in this room, but the textbooks don't reflect it, that we're in a multi-invention world. We're in a multi-innovation world and a multi-invention world. Most of the textbooks are written both, I think, in the law and in economics as if it's a one-product, one-invention world. And analysis can proceed simply on those terms. But as we saw with the smartphone wars, we're talking about products that have hundreds, if not thousands, of essential patents, plus many other patents as well. So there's obviously a level of complexity associated with invention and navigating through intellectual property rights. And if you don't really understand that, then you're likely to make policy errors as well. So we know that in this multi-invention world, it sounds awfully complicated, and in fact, many legal scholars and economists that have looked at this very much fall very rapidly into deep concern about the anti-commons and the sky is falling, despite the fact that many surveys show that actually industry isn't deeply perturbed by that. In fact, because in the main there are private ordering solutions. And what is amazing to me is the number of papers that talk about the anti-commons and the few number that actually deal with the private ordering solutions, which are pretty apparent to anyone that spent a short time in industry. That's not to say that they're perfectly frictionless. They may be a little clunky, but they're there. And before policymakers start jumping in and messing it up, I think it's very important to at least understand what the private ordering solutions are. And usually it's some form of, can range from patent pools to cross-licensing arrangements to acquisitions to mergers. There are ways of doing that, and it gets done. And in fact, if you jump in and create uncertainty, I forget who made this point this morning, if you create a legal uncertainty, in fact, you then interrupt the private ordering solutions. And so it's very important to keep certainty with respect to what the law is, because then private ordering can proceed. And ambiguities typically lead to people sitting on the sidelines, and things go into the courts rather than getting sorted out in the marketplace. My third point is that the world we're in is not just a multi-invention world, but it's also characterized by much greater diversity in the sources of innovation. Most of the textbooks were written, and most of the analysis that we rely upon was done in a world where at least we thought that a good deal of the innovation was at home or was generated from inside the firm. That was never true, by the way. The world has always been one in which innovation has come from not just outside the organization, but outside any individual nation state. The United States, even during the heyday, depended importantly on technology from Europe, particularly in chemicals, but also in pharmaceuticals. And so we've always been in a world in where there are multiple sources of innovation, but the diversity of the sources of innovation has increased dramatically. And there are organizational implications for that. So the open innovation world, or the desire, or the benefits, if you will, from openness expand as the amount of diversity outside the organization increases. So bearing that in mind, I think there is a need to understand better the open innovation story. But it's not a new story. If you go back before 1920, at least when I talk about open innovation, I'm talking about sourcing innovation from someplace other than the in-house corporate R&D team. That was the way the world was organized. The corporate central R&D labs didn't really begin till around the turn, around 1900, 1920 and beyond, and then they started to fall away again after 1970. So the period in the 19th century was one very much where contracts were relied upon to source innovation. In fact, my colleague at Berkeley, David Mowry, wrote his thesis on this, and it was a well-recognized part of the economy, and back then as well as today. Innovation sourced externally and innovation generated internally ought to be thought of as complements and not substitutes. So the so-called open innovation, by which I mean sourcing innovation from external suppliers, is really not a new movement. It's an old movement that's come back, and sometimes it's helpful to remind ourselves of that. And this ties in with the modularity story. Dick Langlois here has, I think, was truly the pioneer in sort of drawing our attention to the importance of modularity. And as he points out, it really, intellectually, this is something that Herbert Simon paid attention to as well. And modularity is something which is important in many industries and has properties attached to it. And the thing I learned today was how modularity can, in fact, I think, be a beneficial structure when, in fact, you marry it with great diversity in external sources of innovation. Because old integrated systems work quite well, too. And so certainly we have to understand that you have integrated systems and modular systems. They each have their virtues. The modular system is great for promoting what I call autonomous innovation. The integrated system is great for promoting what I call systemic innovation, and sometimes to move the economy forward you need systemic innovation. So if everything's modular, the modular system has to be overturned before you actually get a new form of systemic innovation. So I don't think this is a question of one form being better than the other. These are two different forms. And I think in recent years, because of the growth in the diversity of sources of innovation, modular innovation has come into its own. But one should never assume that that means integrated approaches don't work. They do work. And particularly pioneers often have to be integrated. And absent an integrated approach, you often won't get a market started in the first place. Related to this, of course, is the work on platforms, which Andre and others have really taken to a new level of sophistication. While there's been a literature on inside markets now for 20 or so years, I think it's just starting to get clarified in terms of how it works, and there's certainly much to be understood, both from a business policy strategy perspective as well as from a public policy perspective. A lot of the old public policy mantras, like around predatory pricing, get turned on their head when you got zero pricing. The notion that you set marginal costs equal to, you got to do marginal cost pricing where you're performing some misallocation of resources is clearly nonsense. So a lot of standard antitrust pricing models just get turned upside down and inside out once you strike the world of multi-sided markets. And I think there's a lot to be learned there. And in particular, it takes us very much into the assessment of business models. And once again, the whole concept of business model is new. 20 years ago, nobody talked about business models. Why? Because the standard business model was, if you innovated, you produced a product, you sold a product. That's how you got value from innovation. There was always, in the Chandlerian world, there was always demand for new products, growing society, and so forth, so you didn't even have to focus too much on anything other than a little advertising to dispose of the product. So we now have a world where business models are critically important, and understanding how to invent business models and what type of business models work, which is the essence of what the venture capitalists, of course, are trying to focus on. But it's also what Schumpeter was implicitly referring to when he referred to new combinations. So the whole world of platforms and I can say an emerging literature and strategy on business models is, I think, now starting to come together in a useful way. None of this business model literature can be found in economics. Economists don't even know what a business model is. They know what an econometric model is, but they really haven't thought very much about business models, except in this emerging area of multi-sided markets. But there is a long literature in strategy which I think is being usefully brought forward. One of the key findings, I think, from this literature, one of the key lessons is that you do need some kind of governance rules to make the system work. And so in a way, Alfred Chandler and the visible hand sort of is coming back in a new form. It's not coming back in the form of a visible hand inside the organization. It's coming back with respect to a visible hand, with respect to shaping the market context and the multi-sided platform. So the naive notion that you don't need, that the market's going to, quote, sort this out, you have to be careful semantically to recognize that it's not sort of unassisted markets, it's markets where there's a significant entrepreneurial and managerial involvement for there to be any kind of success. So there is, I think, an interesting convergence is hardly the right word, but an interesting transformation of the old sort of Chandlerian view of the enterprise that is still in different form, I think, reflected in what has to happen to make these multi-sided market contexts work. Which brings me to another new concept. And I think I've hit on 5 or 6 new concepts, not new to you, but just simply new to not yet fully embellished in the textbooks. The next concept I want to talk about is what I refer to as the business ecosystem. I think it was probably Bill Gates that first started talking the language of business ecosystem. Obviously, evolutionary biologists have an understanding of what ecosystems are, but there's almost nothing in the economics literature to tell you what an ecosystem is. In part, I think because the concept of industry has been so dominant, I would say too dominant for too long. And the concept of industry, of course, came out of industry analysis with Joe Bain at Berkeley in the 50s, and before that Ed Mason at Harvard in the 30s. But industry analysis still reigns supreme, and even in many business schools. I don't know, Andre, how it sits at Harvard these days. Pardon me?
We parade through the 5 courses.
You parade through it?
We still parade through the 5 courses.
You still pray to it? Well, that was my concern. I'm pleased to say we don't at Berkeley, but we never did, not since Joe Bain passed away. But the fact of the matter is, the 5 forces is fundamentally a structuralist approach that emphasizes industry. And in the field of strategy and in evolutionary economics, it's been well recognized for a long time that firms are heterogeneous. And the data show that performance differences between firms in the same industry are greater than performance differences across industries. So for a long time, the evidence has been there that industry boundaries aren't particularly meaningful. And so the world has been begging for a new way to think systematically about businesses and their environments, and as is typical, it's never the academics that come up with anything new. It's usually, at least in the field of business strategy, it usually comes from industry, and then academics 20 years later will rationalize it and perhaps repackage it, and eventually it'll flow into the textbooks. And I think the ecosystem is a very useful concept, and it essentially recognizes that there are a number of firms that work together to create and sustain new markets. There are a number of firms that work together to create and sustain new markets. It's not just one firm, it's not government, but it's a number of firms that are often complementary to each other. And this is one area where Schumpeter let us down. Schumpeter extolled the virtues of competition, but in essence, he was always thinking substitution, not complements. The gales of creative destruction was always one firm displacing another. He didn't really talk at all about how complements are necessary, how complementary investments are often necessary to make innovation work. And I think many of us have been victims, even the Schumpeterians, to this sort of view that the way innovation takes place is by, the new substituting for the old. It's by the creation of the new in conjunction with the creation of a lot of complementary assets. And so the word that I've come up with to describe this is the world of co-creation. And I suppose the evolutionary biologists would say co-evolution too. But increasingly, innovation is about co-creation. And I think that the multi-sided platforms markets makes that apparent, but I think even at a more general level, it's critical too. I mean, the iPhone would not have worked without the iTunes Music Store. It would not have worked without digital rights management. It wouldn't have worked unless Steve Jobs had gotten the labels to actually put this stuff into the store. So there was a co-creation and a co-invention of a new business model, and the orchestration of these complementary assets that were absolutely critical for the creation of new markets. And this is where economists often come up short too. Markets just always seem to fall like manna from heaven. But we know they don't. They get created. And entrepreneurs create markets. And it's not just individual entrepreneurs, it's clusters of entrepreneurs working together and in complementary ways, often with complementary interests and also with antagonistic interests, but they figure out how to do it. This kind of complexity about the understanding of competition is really absent, I think, from most competition analysis, but it's absolutely critical to what happens in Silicon Valley, and it's there is a very high probability that there'll be policy errors unless these things get better understood and better articulated. Which leads me, finally, well, not finally, but to the walled garden concept. Tom and I, along with Len Waverman, have been thinking about walled gardens, and in some sense, the emergence of a business ecosystem and the management of a business ecosystem is unremarkable. What is remarkable is the fact that somehow or other there are still scholars out there that think that this is a problem, the fact that there wouldn't be, quote, open access, so to speak. And I think we see it as quite unremarkable that if you're going to get a particular customer experience, someone has to manage the system. And it's not purely a regulatory function. It's not really a regulatory function. It's both an entrepreneurial function and an assurance function of customer quality. And so, walled gardens are necessary to deliver benefits for customers. And it's a pretty straightforward proposition that I think is very evident from what Apple has been doing. But there's a lot of literature that seems to think that somehow or other this stuff is going to happen automatically. So therefore, anything that has high walls is something one should be suspicious of. And in my view, that's not true. So just briefly to sum up, I think that what you've seen here today in full glory is the embellishment of a number of absolutely critical concepts that are important to understanding the digital economy that are, quite frankly, not well understood. And let me just sort of tick them off. The old world view, the new world view. First of all, the old world view was an industry, was a unit of analysis. In fact, most of the textbooks still organized that way. What we're saying is a good chunk of the economy, one should be thinking of the ecosystem as a unit of analysis. Second major point is that invention is no longer a single invention, single product story. It's an extraordinarily complicated story that has multiple invention and multiple intellectual property rights as part of the environment that can be effectively negotiated, but needs to be thought about at the time you get into invention. So the dwarfs that Anne Lane Farrar was describing today are ones that, a late entrance, and their IP strategy comes as a Johnny-come-lately. So if they haven't invented before and they haven't thought about IP, they get caught sometimes short. But there are remedies to that, and I think those remedies will play themselves out so long as certainty with respect to the IP regime stands in place. Otherwise, it will crumble. Thirdly, innovation is no longer a linear story. I mean, if you go back, many of the textbooks, it's, there's some amount of investment in R&D which flows through to applied product development, which flows through to market experimentation. And we now know very well, there wasn't much discussion of this here today, that it often flows back the other way from the user upstream, the user downstream, and that you have the complementary as well as parallel elements to it. So innovation is no longer a linear process, and that I think has been true for many, many years now. Appropriability is hard in these environments. That's why patents are important. And there are other mechanisms and other strategies and other business models, as Google has demonstrated, that help with appropriability. But at the end of the day, we also have to recognize that the linchpin of our system of appropriability, in my view, is increasingly going to be patents. As the United States migrates further and further into a creative economy, where it's not specializing and conducting and developing the complements, you're going to have to rely more and more on IP. So when our policymakers get all exercised about patents, I think they're playing into the hands of foreign competitors who have not got the kind of creative skills that we have. And absence a strong and effective IP system, I think that our long-run competitiveness is going to be impaired. So that's, I think, enough. Just let me reiterate how impressed I was by the conference program and the speakers here. I think that for those of you who are students, I think you can take a lot of satisfaction from the fact that here in the law school environment, and I can tell you it's the same in the business school environment, there are active discussions on these issues. Unfortunately, it doesn't go much further. So good luck. So,
Our lunch speaker has graciously consented to take a couple of questions. By the way, David, while you were speaking, I helped out by eating your lunch too. So, maybe we can get another lunch over here. Questions for our speaker? Well, I'll take a shot here. You wrote a great article about 25 years ago on this question of appropriability, the idea that a lot of innovative investments are made, but particularly in creating platforms, but once those benefits start flowing, maybe it's the producers of the complements, the co-creators, that come in and take the profits. So here we look in the marketplace, and just for example, you have Sprint, a cellular network that's invested, $50 to $100 billion in sunk assets to create an environment for wireless communications that tens of millions of people are able to use. And in fact, Apple likes that environment for its iPhone. Its iPhone needs spectrum and infrastructure networks. And so they cut a deal finally, Apple allowing its iconic wireless device to be used on the Sprint network last October. And to get the iPhone, Sprint had to commit to buying 30 million iPhones at $675 per iPhone over 4 years. The price of the stock dropped 10% that day on the announcement. And so Sprint, of course, their CEO's rationale is, well, what are we going to do? We have to have the iPhone. Otherwise, our network is toast. So they've created the network with all this sunk investment now, and it's out there, and they're competing in a small numbers game with a small number of other networks. But to make their network attractive to customers, they've got to bring those high-priced complements in and pay for it. They don't have patent protection. They just have a network. And the dynamics are interesting. Apparently there can't be any mergers in that space. That's U.S. policy now. Yeah. Okay, so is this a problem, or we just enjoy our Apple stock shares?
Well, first of all, the result is completely consistent with my 86 paper, which said that the money will go to where the bottleneck asset is, and that's either IP or it's some kind of specialized or co-specialized asset. And what you see, of course, is, as you point out, there's no IP on the network. And also they have not been able to create any co-specialized sort of add-ons to the network. If you look at Japan with Docomo, they sort of tried to some extent and had some amount of success. But I think absent the ability to move into related complements, I don't think they will do particularly well. So it's a prediction of the framework. Where does it leave you? I think it leaves you thinking that if you're in the ecosystem, you got to be thinking ecosystem. You just can't be thinking infrastructure, which is a strategic error that maybe the network providers made, or maybe the ones the regulators forced upon them. But you're absolutely right. The regulators have got no clue about the nature of competition here and the multifaceted nature of competition, and I think that's in part because of all the things I've been saying. They come with a structuralist approach and a static framework. The chances that you could figure things out in telecom or anything else with that framework is close to zero. Yeah.
You mentioned this interesting thing that economists are 30 years behind. And we had Vernon Smith here for a number of years. He said that, well, most universities are 50 years behind. So
they're catching up.
Why is that the story? Why are the economists so much behind?
Yeah.
What can you do about it, or should you do something about it?
Well, I have thought long and hard about that question. It's really because economists are trying to be very good in a, quote, fully scientific way. It's sort of based on the optimism after the Second World War, where the big science would really provide the solutions. The Manhattan Project and all the key breakthroughs sort of fueled this linear view that if you just got the science right, everything else, you could build a general theory of everything. And the more elegant it was, the better it would be. But we're dealing with messy problems, and if you constantly race for elegance, which is what my colleagues do, they get further and further away from the problems because the problems are too damn complex for any kind of theoretical apparatus that any of us have been able to invent, not just us in this room, but any of the other guys have been able to invent. So it's a very difficult situation because in a way they mean well, but their approach to things leads them away from it. I actually had, I was puzzled by the same question. I had a leading colleague from MIT, a theorist, and after 2 glasses of wine, I put it the same question to him. He says, the problems in this area are too damn difficult. That's why we're not going to address them. So it's solving the problems. It's the old story is they'll look at the problems that are, look for the keys under the lamppost rather than go and find the problems and deal with the problems as they are in the world. So, you know, the answer is the economists are slow because they put artificial handcuffs on themselves, trying to be, in some sense, more scientific. Andre.
If you had another metaphor for economists, so one of my colleagues says economists' wet dream is to construct psychohistory. So for those of you who read Isaac Asimov, it's the science that I can build a model that predicts how history is going to unfold. So that was the analogy. And the question I had, is there a sense, do you think there's a sense in which there might be inefficient Schumpeterian competition today? So here's the example that I have in mind. So I think by now, again, the practical world is way ahead of economists and all the models that we have. But take smartphones. There's this sense that everyone understands that it's so much better to own the bottleneck. So all companies understand that Windows, Microsoft won with Windows because they were able to own the essential bottleneck, and everyone else ended up a small planet orbiting around this big sun, which is Windows. Well, in smartphones, this hasn't happened. It doesn't seem like there's likely to be a winner for the foreseeable future. And there's a ton of people saying we're going to be the platform. But as a result, if you're a small developer, it's terribly inefficient because right now you have to basically write your application for say 6 operating systems. It's terrible because everyone says, I want to be the platform.
All right, so the question is, can dynamic competition lead to inefficiency? Yeah, I mean, there's inefficiencies everywhere. There always will be because we don't have perfect foresight, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think you can sort of use this sort of static inefficiency criteria, and you have to realize there's going to be blind alleys that are pursued and frustrations. I mean, this is the nature of the innovation process, and to expect otherwise is to theorize about a world that will never exist.
I guess I completely agree. My question is, should we even is it possible to have a dynamic equilibrium, which is basically a disequilibrium? Which basically everyone's
well, Schumpeter, I think, thought it was, many other economists have believed that it is really about at least a constant disequilibrium, and you never quite get to a new equilibrium before you get shunted off onto another one. So I think, yes, the notion of a disequilibrium is correct, which comes back to the fundamental question, why don't economists get there? Because they use equilibrium models. So it's not just static models. If you're using equilibrium models, you've got 2 shackles around your ankle. So you have to throw them both away before you have a chance to get at these problems.
Could I just make a comment?
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously on the efficiency question, there's lots of inefficiency in this competition for a standard or for multiple standards. And the question really is there an alternative regime that's going to do better? That's what the efficiency question is. And you're not going to step out and say, the government ought to just clean this up and pick the winner.
No, I wouldn't. No, I would never say that.
Well, not to patronize our guest from Qualcomm today, but that's just a wonderful example we heard about a little earlier. I just wanted to mention it. That in fact, your argument about the inefficiency of competing standards was the argument for the GSM worldwide standard, and the Europeans actually pushed it very aggressively, and there actually was some efficiency to it in the sense of the regulators got behind it for industrial policy purposes, and they pushed licenses out for second generation digital wireless. That got them in a sort of in an active cartel situation to push something much faster than the U.S. and some other countries that were more liberal. And they did get huge economies of scale and scope. And to show you how wrong they were, we're sitting here talking to Qualcomm today about their victory in 3G and 4G because it wasn't the right standard. And competition, which was allowed in the rest of the world, obviously, with all the intended inefficiencies that the Europeans told us they were going to dispense with, those had such valuable properties to the competitive process that here we are in a world where the old GSM standard has really been displaced.
If I can just quickly comment on that. In another sector, aviation, for example, Airbus is often cited as a pro-efficiency example because after World War II, rather than have 15 different national aviation companies for each European country, in which case the winner would have been Boeing, there was an effort to basically rationalize and make more efficient a continental industrial project. Whether or not that's the right approach, I wouldn't hazard a guess. But there was, again, a similar situation where government intervened to basically say competition within Europe would be too messy, and we were handing basically a competitive advantage to non-European competitors. So again, you all can be the judge as to what is the best outcome in that example. But again, there we have governments basically collaborating to basically change the competitive landscape for what some would argue a protectionist end, but that may have had welfare gains for consumer perspective.
Well, that was also in the days where, scale was considered to be everything, and while scale still matters, you must have heard today about 23 to 25 different other competitive variables that matter. There was one other question then.
Before I ask my question, just another brief comment on that point, because there's a direct parallel with the world of video game platform competition, where you've heard a lot of app developers complaining for years about the multiple consoles and the console wars, and yet the competition between those consoles has created remarkable forms of innovation in terms of the peripheral devices and the other types of interfaces that we use to play video games today. Microsoft Kinect came after the Wii, devised a new console and controller. It's a really interesting story, but the app developers still scream bloody murder and ask for a monopoly sometimes. They want one console. EA, for example, develops Madden football for, I think, 7 different platforms now. And they have 7 different teams. And they have a cost for how much that is. But there are 7 different consoles that are doing some interesting things. So the question is to relate 2 issues you discussed in your talk about the walled garden concerns that some raise and policy errors, which is that a lot of the literature these days in the field of cyber law is directly related to this issue, as you know, of what are we going to do about walled gardens? And it's a concern that's gone all the way back to AOL, right? There were policy prescriptions there about how to supposedly deal with that when it ended up being a non-problem. But today it's about Apple, Facebook, Google, so on and so forth. And while we see that as being a very Schumpeterian form of dynamic competition, there are those such as Professor Tim Wu at Columbia and Professor Zittrain, who we discussed earlier this morning, who advocate policy prescriptions to deal with that supposed intolerable form of market power that goes along with having your own little patch of the internet, or maybe off the side of the internet in the form of a walled garden. Professor Wu, for example, now advocating a so-called separations principle for the digital economy, where he would formally have law divide everything up into devices, networks, and content, and strictly segregate them. Now, in your paper with Greg Sidek on dynamic competition, you addressed some of these sorts of concerns and issues and talked about how Schumpeter saw a lot of this, and sometimes you have to tolerate short-term spells of market power and even supernormal profits to get innovation, investment, dynamic competition. It seems to me, so your criticism of the economists, it's just as true of the cyber law people who are...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what they have in common is they assume that in the beginning they're markets, and that entrepreneurship, they just take for granted the whole entrepreneurial creation of markets. And then once something's up and running, they want to kind of just assume that, we might regulate this, it won't have any effect. In fact, it does. It denies you new innovation. It denies you co-creation. It may channel you and give you an advantage in certain areas with respect to certain types of innovation, but in essence, the whole platform creations process is impaired by that approach, and it's really based implicitly on assumption that markets are there anyway. And that's why it's important to recognize that it's entrepreneurs working sometimes together, sometimes against each other, and significant investments have to be made. I mean, that's what we heard in the Qualcomm story, to get things going. And you just can't come in halfway through and take those approaches without dramatic impairment in the longer run to the system. In the short run, you get away with it. So that's why politicians will go for this stuff, because it satisfies current constituents and it harms the future. So the basic policy rule is always favor the future. If you favor the future, then those guys get a big kick in the ass from the frameworks that I'm most familiar with.
Thank you very much.
March 5th? March 7th. Okay. So please enjoy your lunch. Please enjoy your dessert. And I think we've had a great conference today. I hope that our students from the Journal of Law, Economics, and Policy have learned something and are happy to edit some articles from the conference. And I do want to thank all of our speakers. It was really a tremendous session today, and I think everybody contributed very positively. So thanks for that. At the Information Economy Project, we'll be delighted to host one of the most interesting thinkers in media over the last many years, giving a TULIC lecture here on March 7th, Wednesday, March 7th. Giving a TULIC lecture at 4 p.m. And Adam Clayton Powell III has got a long history in broadcasting and academia, and he's going to give a talk about free speech and free society, how new technology is taking us to the future. And he's really quite an innovative thinker, and I'm sure those who get an opportunity to join us on March 7th will enjoy it. Anyway, with that, enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.